Friends, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our program tonight. This is a very special evening tonight because we're joined by Scott Ritter for a talk about Russia, Ukraine, NATO, current events, very serious current events that we're all very concerned about. We're going to hear about Scott's books, Disarmament and the Time of Perestroika and Scorpion King. As you've seen already, for people who are here with us live, we have a table back there where people can purchase copies of Scott books, which he'll be signing. So the format of tonight's event is Scott will be giving a talk, a discussion, and after that, we'll do a Q&A. And after that, we will do the book signing. So thank you again, everyone, so much for joining us. I'm very excited for today's program. We're joined here by a live audience and also about 200-300 people on Zoom, along with whoever's streaming live, if the live stream is working. So we're very excited for today's program. We're here at the Community Church of Boston, okay? And this is a pretty historic institution, a peace and justice congregation since 1920. This building has been here for 100 years. And in the last 100 years, it's had a pretty remarkable history. Dr. Martin Luther King spoke with this institution, Rosa Parks, W.E.B. Du Bois, and what was perhaps the most monumental speech a couple of weeks ago delivered by yours truly. So no, just kidding. The illustrious history and tradition of this church is better continued tonight by our guest, Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter, as many of you know, he's a Marine, a former Marine, and UN's weapons inspector. He's an expert on Russian affairs, military affairs, geopolitics. Many of you have been following him, some for the last few months and many others for the last many years. So we're very excited to have Scott Ritter here tonight. Scott, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I didn't realize I was speaking in a venue with such a storied history. I was confident coming here. Now I'm a little nervous because those are big shoes to fill. But again, it's a privilege to be here. You know, what's on everybody's mind right now, of course, is the conflict in Ukraine. And you know, I've been labeled a number of things when it comes to this. I've been called a Russian propagandist. I've been called an information terrorist. I am a war criminal. Now, this is all according to the Ukrainian government. This may be a Ukrainian assassin here trying to kill me with the microphone, but I'm on a hit list. You know, I'm marked for assassination. I'm not too worried about that, but it is what it is. It's a real hit list. People do die. So I'm just going to calm you down right now. I'm not a Russian propagandist. I'm not an information terrorist. And to the best of my knowledge, I'm not a little bit closer either. You know, international humanitarian law being what it is, and statute of limitations, and the fact that I've been to war, who knows? But I think I did it right. But when it comes to this conflict, taking a side is a problem. You see, when you look at a conflict, very few people can just step back and say, I am 100% neutral on this one. Now, in theory, I should be. I'm an American. I don't care about other people's fights, to be honest with you. I'm more worried about keeping my country out of fights. And if we can keep my country out of fights, we have a tendency to avoid creating problems in the world that affect my country. That's my number one priority. That doesn't mean that I don't have a heart and a soul and that, you know, I don't bleed inside when I see other people suffering. I do. I'm just not somebody who believes that America is the world's policeman and that we should be going out telling other people what to do, how to do, and when to do it. That being said, on the Russian-Ukraine conflict, as an American, I can't be an impartial observer because my country has taken a side. And I'm not taking the side, let's talk about taking a side right now. We made this conflict possible. We're the ones. There, we got issue. You need me to speak louder or to the mic like this? Okay, I can do that. Just don't want to knock my teeth out, but It's okay. I'm 61. Who cares? My point is, my government has taken a side. And it's not the side that we're, the issue that we're funding Ukraine today and supporting Ukraine politically and diplomatically, et cetera. We started this war. We're the ones responsible for this conflict. And our responsibility goes back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now, we'll be talking about that a little bit. I wrote a book that touches on this, Disarmament, the Time of Perestroika. But the fact of the matter is, when the Soviet Union, or when the Warsaw Pact collapsed in 1989, 1990, there was discussions going on about what's going to happen in the post-Cold War environment. What's the role of NATO? What's the role of the Warsaw Pact? How does Germany reunify? People tend to forget today that Germany was an occupied country. And there's a reason why Germany was an occupied country. And that used to be called Nazi Germany. And they fought a war against the United States, the Soviet Union, and others, and we won. And when we won, we said no more Nazis. We occupied their country and we denazified them, or we tried to, or didn't we try to? I don't know. Werner von Braun got us to the moon. So, hey, we didn't try that hard. But the point is, we pretended to be anti-Nazi, and we said never again. But what we didn't do is finalize it. There was no peace treaty. No peace treaty. And you know who'd been asking for a peace treaty for all this time, for the decades of occupation? The Soviets. They're saying, we need to finalize the German issue. We would like to see a unified Germany, but we don't want to see a militarized Germany. We don't want to see a militarized, industrialized Germany. We need to have guarantees that this will never happen again. 27 million reasons why they didn't want it to happen again. And that's the number of Soviet citizens who lost their lives in the conflict against Nazi Germany. But in 1990, the Soviets were saying, hey, what can we do to make this dissolution work? We don't want it to devolve. We don't want it to become a problem. We don't want violence. We have 400,000 troops in East Germany occupying it because they lost the war, and the war ain't over till there's a peace treaty. But to get a peace treaty, we have to be certain that you're not going to take advantage of this, you being the United States and NATO. That if Germany is unified, NATO won't expand. And Gorbachev was given assurance after assurance after assurance. Then Secretary of State James Baker spoke with Shevardnadze, spoke with Gorbachev. The German leader spoke with Shevardnadze, Gorbachev. The French leader, all the leaders spoke, and they all said the same thing: not 1 inch eastward. NATO will not expand 1 inch eastward. And so the Soviets left Germany. A peace treaty was negotiated and signed. Germany became unified, and instantly the United States lied. James Baker came back from his meeting with Gorbachev, met with the National Security Council, and said, hey, I told the guy not 1 inch eastward. And they went, why? Why would you tell him that? We're going all the way, buddy. We're going all the way. You see, the United States had a policy about post-Soviet the political existence. We never wanted Russia to rise up and challenge us the way that the Soviet Union did. We wanted to keep Russia down. And the best way to keep Russia down would be to expand NATO, gobbling up all those former Soviet bloc countries right up to the border of Russia, and then work in this post-Soviet reality to destabilize Russia economically. Ask yourself why Russia was such a nutcase in the 1990s. Now, a lot of people say, Gorbachev, yeah, he bears responsibility. But Yeltsin, yep, he was an alcoholic and a horrible leader. But it was the United States leading the charge, going in there with our capitalism and our democracy. And we didn't have capitalism. Capitalism is supposed to be about the economy governed by something that resembles the rule of law. This was outright robbery, theft, pillaging. We were robbing them blind. We empowered a handful of people to become billionaires, and then we allowed them to take their billions out to our banks, while we also stripped Russia of everything of value. Who suffered? The Russian people, and they suffered egregiously. Anybody who lived during that time will tell you it was the worst thing in their memory since the end of the Second World War. It was horrible, and we did it. We're to blame. And we did it on purpose. It wasn't by accident. Our goal was to get Russia to break up, to get Russia to fragment into various constituent parts so that none of these parts would be by themselves able to challenge us. See, we were a paranoid superpower. We didn't want anybody to ever have the ability to challenge us like the Soviet Union did again. Now, that means that this conflict started decades ago. Decades ago. It was a concept driven by the imperative to keep Russia down, keep Russia weak. In 1996, I mean, everybody's like, well, the Russians interfered with our election in 2016. Maybe, maybe not, probably not. But we interfered in their election in 1996. We bought the darn thing. We stole it. We bragged about it. How many Russian newspapers have on their front cover, we stole the American election? None. Time magazine has a cover story in 1996 saying, we bought the Russian election. We, America, we did it. We went in there and we got Yeltsin and he wasn't going to win the election. Zhuganov, the communist, was coming back. We didn't want the communists back. So we bought the election and we're proud of it. We're bragging about it. So much for democracy. Then something happened. This unknown, this former KGB officer, this St. Petersburg bureaucrat emerged from nowhere to become first the head of the FSB, the follow on to the KGB, then prime minister. The next thing you know, he's president. And everybody's going, Vladimir who? Putin. Who? Don't know him. Don't know anything about him. He emerged from nowhere. He was literally the accidental president. You want to know why he became president? He was the most honest man around Yeltsin at the time. Yeltsin was surrounded by something called the family. And the family was this, it was his immediate family, his daughter, son-in-law, but then all the oligarchs and all the people who rose up with Yeltsin pocketing billions of dollars, the most corrupt people on the planet. And they were circling Yeltsin like sharks because Yeltsin was old, Yeltsin was feeble, he was unhealthy, he was drunk. And they were waiting for Yeltsin to go away, and then they were going to move in. And Yeltsin knew what they moved in, he and his family, his immediate family, it was over. They were going to be arrested, they were going to die, it was going to be ugly. How does he save his skin and save Russia at the same time? Because I think Yeltsin was also starting to wake up that he had made a lot of mistakes. There was only one person in his entourage that he could trust. That was Vladimir Putin. Because Vladimir Putin just wanted to serve his country. Not a corrupt bone in his body. Everybody goes, Scott, you can't say that. I know I can't say it because I never met the guy. But you know, the Consul General of St. Petersburg from the United States of America can say it. He met him repeatedly. And he said he's the most honest man out there, never takes a bribe, doesn't make any demands, simply listens to you, asks questions, and does his job. NGOs that went there, the leaders of non-governmental organizations met with him repeatedly. He's the only one who didn't slide a piece of paper across the table with a number on it, because that's how you did business in Russia back then. You sat down, they went to sleep as you gave your pitch because they didn't care. All they wanted was cash in an envelope to the number that they slid across the table. The only guy that didn't do that was Vladimir Putin. You won't find anybody that'll say, I received a number from Putin and I gave him money. They'll say, I heard somebody said that. Somebody thinks that happened. You won't find one person that says that happened because it didn't happen. I'm not saying Putin's perfect. He's not. I am saying he's the least corrupt individual around Boris Yeltsin at a time when Yeltsin was looking for somebody to step up and save Russia, and Putin stepped up and he saved Russia. You want to know what kind of guy this guy is? When Yeltsin came up to him and said, I need you to become president, he said, not me, babe. I'm not, that's not my job. I'm not up to it. I don't want this job. And Yeltsin said, you got to take it. So he did. Yeltsin resigned, gave his New Year's address. Putin filmed his New Year's address. And then you know what he did? Imagine this. He got on a helicopter and he flew to Chechnya, where they were involved in a war, a horrible war. And his first act as president was to go visit the troops at the front and wish them a happy new year, shake their hands and say, you matter to me, you count. Guys, I know we're supposed to be peace activists, but I'm telling you as a former Marine, that's one hell of a gesture. To have your commander in chief, this is first act, come to the front lines and meet you and tell you, I got your back. And he wasn't just telling the troops that, he was telling Russia that, I've got your back. Things are going to get better. I guarantee it. And he followed up. He did. He delivered on the goods. Ask anybody who's in Russia today. Compare and contrast what's going on in Russia today with what's going on in the 1990s, and you can't say, oh, it's worse today. You won't find anybody who says that. The 1990s was the worst, and Putin has made dramatic improvements. You know who's irritated about it? The United States. See, we didn't want Vladimir Putin to be in power. That's why we bought Boris Yeltsin his re-election in 1996. And we've been conspiring to undermine Putin ever since. Again, I'm talking about the roots of the current conflict began way, way back from the very beginning. The moment Vladimir Putin became president, we said he has to go because he's not the leader we want for Russia. He's talking about a strong Russia. We don't want a strong Russia. We want a weak Russia. We want a Russia that's compliant to the West, not a Russia that says we're the equal. Russia that wants a seat at the table. And so from 2000 until today, we've been engaged in a policy of regime change, trying to remove Vladimir Putin from power. Now, we tried to do it the soft way early on. You know, George W. Bush brought him over to the Crawford Ranch and looked him in the eyes, said, I saw his soul. I don't know, George, if you're that good, you should have run for a third term because you got God on your side. But the point is, you know, Putin was just being Putin. You know, he wasn't exposing his soul. He was just being very blunt about who he is and what he wants for Russia. What he doesn't want is Russia to be challenging the United States on the global stage. What he does want is for Russia to assume its natural place in the world. And when I say natural place, understand it's one of the largest energy producers in the world. It's an economic powerhouse. We have people saying it's just a gas station disguised as a country. Really? How's that working, guys? I mean, if you're going to mock a country and call it a gas station disguised as a country, don't be an automobile stuck in the middle of nowhere with an empty gas tank, because suddenly that gas station disguised as a country's looking pretty relevant, pretty good. Again, we can go into the history of this. We could talk about the Obama administration, the reset. Remember the button, the red button, yellow box, push it, everything's fine and dandy, misspelled word, doesn't mean what it wanted, didn't work, because it wasn't about a reset with Russia. It was about regime change. The reason why we went into a reset is because Putin had done his 2 legal terms under the Constitution, couldn't run for a 3rd consecutive term, so he did a flop with the prime minister, who was Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev is now president, Putin's now prime minister, and we went, here's our chance. Suddenly we're all nice with Russia. Hey, Dmitry, looking pretty good, buddy. Want to go out to dinner, movie, a date with America? We like you now. We're your friend. We want to help you. Let me help you. And Medvedev went, well, what we'd like you to do is get back in the ABM Treaty. Not so fast, Dmitry, on the first date. Really, man. Calm down, chill it. No ABM Treaty. Not going to do that. Well, we'd like it if you didn't bomb Libya. Come on, buddy. Tee me, baby. No, we're going to bomb Libya. We're going to do anything we want. Don't you understand the nature of the relationship here? We just want you to kneel before us and bow like Yeltsin did. And Medvedev wasn't going to play that game. Joe Biden was vice president at that time. Joe Biden was heavily involved in trying to undermine Vladimir Putin's return. Imagine, if you would, in an American election, if a senior Russian, let's say Medvedev himself, flew to the United States, let's say it happens next year, 2023, and he meets with the Republican Party, the opposition, and he says, Joe Biden shouldn't run for re-election. It'll be bad for Joe Biden. It'll be bad for America. I don't care where you stand in politics. That should just irritate the living, you know what, out of you. A foreigner doesn't come to my country and tell me what's good for my country, tell me what's good for anybody. Get the hell out of my country. But Joe Biden flew to Moscow, met with the opposition, and said Putin shouldn't run for re-election. It'd be bad for Russia, bad for Putin, because our policy was regime change. Putin ran for election, won, and he's back in president. But now he knows where the United States stands. We're trying to remove him from power. The Maidan revolution of 2014 was a coup d'etat in Kiev. You can pretend it's a revolution, but it wasn't. It started out as a peaceful demonstration. I'm not denying that the first demonstrators in Maidan in the in December of 2013, where I believe they were there to peacefully demonstrate against a decision made by the lawfully elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, not to pivot to the EU, but to stick with Moscow. And they said, you betrayed us. You promised we're going to EU. Hey, you know what? You have a right to demonstrate. Please demonstrate peacefully. And if enough of you come out there and you can get sort of this gravitas, maybe you can get him to change his mind. But the United States didn't want a peaceful demonstration. We wanted the violent overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych. So we went to our old buddies, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN-B, B for Bandera, Stepan Bandera. Stepan Bandera is one of the most odious characters in global history. He's a man who believes in the supremacy of the Ukrainian nationality. Now, that's okay. I'm proud to be American too, you know. But see, I don't want to go around and kill everybody because I'm an American. But Stepan Bandera didn't just want to kill people, he did kill people. The thousands of men who operated under his command are responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Jews. The massacre in Lvov, when the Germans went in 1939, Bandera's guys did it. The people who pulled the trigger in Babi Yar in 1941, Bandera's people. Ask the Poles how they feel about Wolin, a region in Poland where over 110,000 Polish men, women, and children were slaughtered by Bandera's people. You know what their specialty was? To go to a village, take everybody, put them in a barn, then set it on fire and sit back and laugh as the people burned to death. Any people who managed to get out, they'd shoot for fun because they really got off on this kind of thing. And they killed hundreds of thousands of Russians too. Now, Bandera is a Ukrainian nationalist, so he originally fought on the side of the Germans against the Soviets, and then later on, when the Germans didn't get him what he wanted, they put him in a sort of a soft prison, but they released him later on so he could fight again. Then when the Germans went away, he continued to stay in place and fight the Soviets, first as undercover force for the Germans, working for German intelligence, Nazi intelligence, I should be clear, a guy named Gehlen, the Gehlen organization. And then when Nazi Germany was defeated, we came in and we brought in Gehlen. We said, don't surrender, boss. Just come over. You work for us now. We want your whole organization. I know you guys are Nazis. I know you committed war crimes, but we don't care. We want the people you control in the former Soviet Union, including Stepan Bandera, and they're going to work for us now. So from 1945 to 1954, we ran a covert war against the Soviets in Ukraine using Stepan Bandera's Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists. This war cost about 300,000 people their lives. How many Americans know about this war? Not too many. Not too many. 300,000 people, 200,000 Ukrainians, 100,000 Russians. Depending on your numbers, the Soviets lost between 8,000 and 30,000 of their own troops. So this isn't a small little, you know, Red Army faction thing, killing a person here. This is straight up war. And it went from 1945 to 1954, and it was funded by the United States of America, the Central Intelligence Agency. Now they got beat. And what happened to these people when they got beat? They fled to Europe, and then they went on diaspora. They went to Canada. They came here to the United States. In Ellaville, New York, 60 miles away from where I live, there's a park called Heroes Park. And in Heroes Park, they have the statues of Stepan Bandera, Roman Stukovich, and other neo-Nazi mass murderers. And every summer, they bring kids in who wear brown Nazi uniforms, and they parade around holding the photographs of these people up, praising their works. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Now, those words by themselves means, yeah, I say, glory to the Marine Corps. You know, Scott Ritter, you're a racist. No, I'm not. I'm just praising the Marine Corps. But when you say Slava Ukraina, as Nancy Pelosi did proudly on the floor of the United States Congress, it's like saying Sieg Heil. Now, do you want to tell me that Sieg Heil just means to victory? Sieg Heil. I'm just saying to victory? No, you know darn well what I just did. If I use those two words and my hand goes up, you know what that is. That's a Nazi salute and a Nazi cry. So let's not pretend that Slava Ukraina is not what it is. It's the cry of the Bandera movement. It is a cry of Ukrainian white supremacy, Ukrainian Aryan supremacy, and the arrogance of the Ukrainian nationalists that they have a right to kill the subhumans, Poles, Russians, Jews. We put them in power, ladies and gentlemen. 2014, we put them in power. Now, some in Congress got a little irritated about that. Starting in 2015, because we were providing hundreds of millions of dollars per year to train the Ukrainian army. We'll get to that in a second. But Congress went, well, wait a minute. There's a Nazi problem in Ukraine, a Nazi problem. Everybody knew it. It's the Bandera movement, the right sector, Sloboda, Azov Battalion. So Congress put an amendment on the defense appropriations bill that said, you can't take our money and use it to train the Nazis. They used that term, the Nazis. In 2019, the Democrats wrote a letter to then Secretary of State Pompeo. They said, why aren't you labeling the Nazis a foreign terrorist organization? Because they're a white supremacist neo-Nazi group. Why are we supporting them? Why are we tolerating them? Congress knew exactly who these people are and what they represented until Russia went into Ukraine. And then it's like the memory's wiped. Jamie Raskin was one of these congressmen who signed a letter to Pompeo condemning the policies of the Trump administration for funding Nazis. But on April 28th, after he sent out a tweet praising the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and I support that, by the way, the Holocaust should never be forgotten, ever, never again. I believe that. Does Jamie believe that? He tweeted about it, but then he went on the floor of Congress and chastised a Republican congressperson. I'm not here singing her praises, Marjorie Taylor Greene. We all know she's not perfect, but she got up there and she was saying the right thing. We're funding Nazis. Why are we funding Nazis? And he said, what Nazis? You have no proof. Jamie, I have your name on a letter. You signed the letter saying there's Nazis in Ukraine, but they're still there. They haven't gone away. And the problem manifests itself over and over again. And what I'm trying to get at here, ladies and gentlemen, is that when we have this conflict in Ukraine, there's history. And you can either be on the right side of history or the wrong side of history. You can't be in the middle, especially if you're an American, because your government has aligned itself to the wrong side of history. If you're supporting the Nazis, you're on the wrong side of history. If you've been trying to undermine the Russians, overthrow the Russian government, push them into a corner by trying to invite Ukraine into NATO, even though you promised never to expand NATO, you're on the wrong side of history. Now, when I was back protesting the war in Iraq, I used to say that, first of all, I'm not a pacifist. I hope you guys know that. Don't condemn me, but I'm not. You want to fight my country, I'll kill every one of you. I don't believe in peace. I believe in war. But I believe war should be the last thing we ever do, that we have to exhaust every possibility short of war before we go to war. Every possibility. We should never send people off to die in combat if there's the potential to resolve this problem peacefully. You know who exhausted every possibility short of war before making the decision to go into Ukraine? Vladimir Putin. He did everything. Did everything. There was a negotiated peace in 2015, the Minsk Agreement. And it wasn't that Putin was trying to impose it on Ukraine. France and Germany came together in something called the Normandy Format, and they're the ones that took the lead and said, we need peace. We need to bring this issue to an end. Russia, work with us on this. And Putin said, okay, I'll work with you if you guys are serious about it. They said, we're serious. They said, the Ukrainians, all these people that you're trying to kill in the Donbass, these Russians, what needs to happen is you have to pass laws that protect their rights. Give them some sort of autonomy so that they don't fall victim to your anti-Russian laws that you've been passing. Again, right side of history, wrong side of history, go to the laws that have been passed by the Ukrainian parliament that ban the Russian language, ban Russian culture, ban Russian everything. Now remove the term Russian, insert the term Jew, and you have the same laws that Germany passed in the 1930s. Right side of history, wrong side of history. Putin's on the right side of history, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I'll take questions from you later on about this, but I just wanted to set this up, where I come from on the issue of what's going on in Ukraine today. I'm on the right side of history. That's my opinion. You're welcome to challenge me. Now, this war is a bad deal. It's a horrible war. I'm not sitting here saying, yay, Russia, kill more Ukrainians. It's the last thing I'm saying. I'm actually saying we need to be working overtime. We being the United States, since we started this conflict, we need to be working overtime to have an off-ramp to this conflict. And people say, well, things are so bad today. How could you possibly talk about a diplomatic off-ramp? There will never be good relations between the United States and Russia. I said, wow, I think I've heard this before. It was in the 1980s when I was in the Marine Corps. You know, we called them the evil empire. They called us enemy number one. We almost went to nuclear war several times. We had hundreds of thousands of men on the border of Germany. They had hundreds of thousands of men on the border in East Germany. We were ready to go to war at a drop of a hat. Things were really bad. We had built new nuclear weapons. They had the SS-20 missile. We had the Pershing missile. And we were this close to global nuclear annihilation. I'm not joking. It was real. I was there. I know. You know what happened? We signed a treaty. As bad as relations were, we signed a treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and we worked with the Soviets to get rid of an entire class of weapons that were threatening Europe and the world with annihilation. I was involved in that treaty. I came in on the ground floor. One of the proudest things in my resume, it's sort of an ego thing, but I'm proud of it nonetheless. I was the first inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union. Number one, baby. It was an accident. Should have happened. When they recruited me, they thought I spoke Russian. I took Russian. It's on my resume, but I was in college. I was playing football and drinking beer, and Russian was not in the top of my priority. I did enough to pass, and it shows that I passed, but the headquarters Marine Corps said, we need Russian speakers. Ritter speaks Russian. Send them to the agency. I showed up, and they had a lieutenant colonel. We call him Pulemyot Kelly. Pulemyot means machine gun. And it wasn't because he was deadly with a machine gun. He was a Marine, but it was because he spoke Russian so fast. He was fluent. Even the Russians said, you speak Russian so well that we know you're not a Russian. You speak it better than the Russians do. You're grammatically correct every single time. And I had walked in as a first lieutenant in an organization that had nothing but majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels. I was literally a fish out of water. It was so bad that when I showed up, this is no joke, an Air Force lieutenant colonel came up and said, Lieutenant, coffee machine's over there. The implication was the only thing I was good for was getting coffee. Well, I didn't get him coffee because the general walked in at that time and introduced himself to everybody. And when the general left, this Army lieutenant colonel came up and said, who are you and why are you here? You understand that everybody here is the best expert on the Soviet Union and the United States military. They're all foreign area officers. They all have advanced degrees. They all speak the language fluently. They all have been immersed in the culture. Many of them have done tours in Moscow as defense attachés, spying. And many of them have served in the U.S. military liaison mission in East Germany, spying. These are the real guys, the real deal. These are the superstars of the Cold War. Why are you here? I said, I have no idea. I got orders. I was supposed to go to the Marine Corps and kill people, but they brought me here and I don't know why. And he said, do you want to be an inspector? I said, yes, sir, I want to be an inspector. He said, okay, we'll make you one. But then Pulemyot Kelly found out, tested my Russian, found out I was inadequate, called me an embarrassment to the Marine Corps, an embarrassment to the service. He fired me on the spot. He said, you're going home to the Marine Corps. We don't know why they sent you here. Long story short, being, Marine officers abhor leadership vacuums. We don't do well when we look and we say something needs to be done and nobody's doing it. We have a tendency to say, then I have to do it. And before they fired me, I wriggled my way into doing certain things like running counterintelligence for the entire organization. How that happened, you read about in the book. But the bottom line is I was doing something that I wasn't qualified to do, and I was doing it at a big level. I got the Assistant Secretary of Defense to do a special access program on counterintelligence polygraph program. I thought it was the coolest thing in the world, and the general decided it was the worst thing in the world, and he dissolved it. But in doing so, he said, I like your gumption. And then he said, I'm going to send you over to this new group of inspectors called portal monitors. Their job is to go to Vodkinsk, this Soviet missile factory 700 miles east of Moscow, where they are used to produce missiles at SS-20, and we have to make sure they aren't producing them anymore. So you're going to be part of the team outside that factory. In June, they sent me there 14 days before the treaty was implemented with an advanced party of inspectors to help pave the way for the arrival of 30 Americans full-time living there. That's how I got to be the first person inspector in Russia, because when the clock ticked over on July 1st, the treaty's in force, I'm on the ground, and Colonel Kelly, I'm here, buddy. You're flying in on an airplane still. You're the second inspector on the ground. But I'm not that petty. Maybe. But what we did for the next couple of years was just fantastic. It was one of the best things in my life. I went from being a Marine who lived and breathed killing Russians to a guy who was working with Russians to get rid of the missiles that were threatening global peace. It was one of the most transformative moments in my life. And I loved every aspect of it. But the key takeaway here isn't just that it was a cool story. Hey, it's a cool story. But the key takeaway is that it provides a template on how we can do it, how we can repair relations with Russia. You see, right now, we don't have active arms control. We have a treaty that nobody's paying attention to. They're not even letting inspectors operate right now. Relations are so bad. The INF Treaty that I was involved in no longer exists. And yet the weapons are coming back and they're providing the same level of threat. Everybody's talking about the potential of nuclear conflict. So how do we get out of this mess? George Santayana, American philosopher, said those who forget the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. But the implication there is that the lessons of history are bad. Sometimes the lesson of history is good. Sometimes the lesson of history is a success story. And those who fail to learn the successes of history are condemned not to have the opportunity to repeat it. This book provides a template of hope on how the United States and Russia can move forward from this horrible situation we're in today. So I encourage people to buy the book. I'll sign it, et cetera. Now, Amar mentioned something, and I'll throw it out to you. He said, people are interested in the conversation I had with Roger Waters. And I could stop right now and go straight to questions, or I can address this at this point in time. I'll leave it up to you. What would you guys want me to talk about, Roger? Everybody okay with Roger? All right, here we go. Me and Roger. And the reason why I want to talk about this is it'll introduce me to you. So when you start asking questions, you know a little bit more about me. In 1978, I was a senior in high school. And all the people that listened to Pink Floyd were not the people I hung out with. I was a Rolling Stones kind of guy. Some Girls was my album. And I hung out with the football team. We went up to the castle. We snuck beer up to the castle. We'd get out there in the break, chug a beer, go back to class. I was trying to get Betsy Ensign to go to prom with me. She did. So it wasn't a bad year. But all I was focused on was what was going to happen after high school. I wanted to go in the military. I was a child of the Cold War. I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to fight Russians. Fast forward, 1983, my senior year in college. I've just finished my final summer training program with the Marine Corps, officer candidate school. And I'm now looking at a piece of paper that says, if you sign this, you're going in the Marines. Now, this is something that everybody should think about, how a 17-year-old is so gung-ho because you don't know life. You don't know anything about life. You just want to go to war. But at 23, after you've experienced a little bit of life, there's a little bit of hesitation. I mean, I still played football. I love football. I still drank beer and I still liked girls, but I wasn't thinking about taking the girls to the prom. I was thinking about marrying them and starting a family of my own. And an album came out. It was called The Final Cut. It's a Pink Floyd album. And I put it on and I listened to it and it blew me away. Blew me away. Because it talks about war, the thing I'm getting ready to do. And I'm like, holy cow, this is serious stuff. Do I want to do this? And there's a song in particular called The Gunner's Dream. And, I'm not going to sing it, but it's basically about a tail gunner in a bomber that gets blown out of the airplane. And as he's falling to the ground, certain of his death, he thinks about why I'm fighting. Is it, why am I here? I'm about to die. Why am I doing this? And he thought about his mom going to his funeral and, what he could say to her to make it okay. And he said, a place to stay, something to eat, somewhere old heroes can walk safely in the street. He said, a place where you can speak out about your doubt and fears, and no one ever disappears. You never have to hear the standard issue kicking in your door. He said, we can relax on both sides of the tracks. And maniacs don't blow holes in bandsmen by remote control. He said, everybody has recourse to the law, and no one kills the children anymore. No one kills the children anymore. I said, damn it, I can do that. I can fight for that. I signed the paper. I joined the Marine Corps. Fast forward. February 1991, Gulf War. I'm in the thick of things. I'm involved in the counter-Scud operations. Scud missile is the Iraqi, Soviet-made Iraqi missile. They're firing them at us in Saudi Arabia. They're firing them at Israel. When they fire them at Israel, and then let's take the politics out of this, people. Let's just talk about humans. When they fired it at Israel, the first time they fired it, the missile hit the ground. It had some residual fuel in it. Some of the fuels, it's called IRFNA, inhibited red nitric fuming acid. It's red. And when the Israelis put everybody, they told them the Iraqis might be using chemical weapons. So all the Israelis built this special room in their home where they saran wrapped it, made it proof, and they gave gas masks to everybody. And the families were in there and they were panicked. Imagine this. You've got a gas mask. You're not properly trained on the gas mask. And suddenly you're told, alarm, alarm, alarm. You're in your room and you're putting the gas mask on yourself and you have a baby and you're putting the gas mask on the baby too. The missile hits. The first responders from Israel come in with their detectors and they misidentify the fuel as chemical agent. So they don't lift the alarm. And the families are in this room, but the baby can't breathe. And the mother's sitting there holding the baby and the baby's struggling. But the mother can't take the mask off because it's chemical weapons. And the baby dies. This happened over and over and over again. No one kills the children anymore, but they're dying. And I'm aware of that. So I need to get rid of these scuds. That's my job. Now, before I came to the war, back when I was doing the inspections, I was asked to go do an inspection. They called them radiation detection inspections of SS-25 missiles, which are big missiles that we thought could be hiding the SS-20s. Long story short, we'd go there, we'd set up this detector, we'd measure the radiation from the warhead, and we'd determine whether it's one warhead, SS-25, 3 warheads, SS-20. That's not why I was sent. I was sent because I was a good observer. And I would observe these missiles up close, and then later on when we fly back, the CIA would have me draw sketches of it. The sketches were deemed to be so good that I was invited to a place called the Foreign Intelligence Division, United States Air Force. And they were building a radar that could be put on a B-52 bomber and fly over the Soviet Union and discriminate between decoys and the real thing. And they needed me to talk about materials, angles, all the things that are involved in radar absorption, radar reflection. And I did it. It was pretty cool. But then I left. Now I'm in Iraq and I'm taking a look. The Iraqis only had 19 launchers, but I'm looking at the reports and we've killed 60. Now, Marines aren't very good at math, but I'm telling you right now, if they only have 19, we've killed 60, something's wrong. There's decoys out there. They're using decoys. So I said, hey, they had this radar, and why don't I go in and inspect some of the sites that we bombed and reconstruct the radar signature of the decoy that's there so that we can bring in this bomber, fly it over, and we could discriminate between the real thing and the fake thing and take it out. And they went, that's a great idea, Scott. So I got sent to the SEALs, and we were going to go in and we're going to go to this one site that we had picked out where it looked like it was a Scud, got bombed, and we were training up to do the mission. Turned out it wasn't a Scud. It was a Bedouin tent at night. The silly Bedouins brought their sheep in, and the infrared signature on the Maverick missile picked up a long, what looked like cylindrical object. And when they fired the Maverick in there, it blew up, and they said killed Scud, but it was just a bunch of dead sheep and dead Bedouins. So they canceled the mission. But then I got invited to go to this other unit, these really special guys. You might have heard of them, Delta Force, the best of the best. Delta Force is up north in Saudi Arabia. They're crossing into Western Iraq, and they're hunting the Scuds. And they had found something that looked like a Scud. I was sent up to investigate it. It was a decoy. This is what I wanted, the decoy. I needed to get that decoy. So I flew in, and I met with these guys. But as I talked to them, I noticed they're all a little bit down. They're a little depressed. Well, you see, the same night I arrived, that morning, every organization has its superstars. Delta Force had a guy named Patrick Hurley. Patrick Hurley was one of the original founding members of Delta Force. He went to Iraq to try and rescue people in Desert One. And during the Panama invasion, he was the sniper that took out the Panamanian with the grenades who was going to blow up Kurt Muse before he could be rescued. Kurt Muse was a CIA agent being held by Noriega's people. Guy's a legend. And Patrick Hurley is out in Western Iraq with a patrol called Dart Patrol. And it's raining, the weather is miserable. And he's setting his guys in for the night. And he's up on top of a wadi, and he slips and he falls 80 feet to the bottom. Now he gets up, he's feeling a little pain, and he goes in, he says, hey, I fell. And his medic says, sit down, we stabilize him. We think you might have a spinal injury. We need a medevac. The weather sucks. They say, who wants to fly this mission? A guy named Charles Cooper says, send me. Mike Anderson, another pilot, send me. We need medics. Otto Clark, send me. Eloy Rodriguez, send me. We need crew chiefs. Chapman, Mario Vega Velasquez, send us. And they flew in. Now, this is back in the day when you didn't have GPS on these helicopters. It was all done by time and direction. You had a map, you flew at a certain speed, a certain altitude for a certain time, hit a point, and navigate. They had to do dead navigation hundreds of miles into Iraq to find this place in the middle of nowhere. And they did it. The weather was horrible, sleet. You're flying low to the ground. You can't go high. The radar picks you up to get shot down. They're going in to rescue Patrick Hurley. The medic on the scene comes out and he hears the helicopter coming because you can't talk on the radio because the Iraqis will pick up the signal and they'll come in and they'll attack you. So he breaks an infrared stick, puts it on a string and spins it. And the pilots can see the spinning arc and they come in and they land. And they load Patrick Hurley up on the helicopter and they fly him back, but the weather's bad. The weather's really bad, horrible. So they're flying back and they get to the base, but it's fogged in, frozen fog. So they start making turns. Look, and they ask them to turn on the lights. So they turn on the lights, but you can't see the lights. So Chapman and Vega Velasquez are leaning out the helicopter, looking for the ground, looking for the ground. They make one pass, they can't do it. Otto Clark and Eloy Rodriguez are holding Patrick Hurley stable because he has a spinal injury and they're making turns. So they're trying to stabilize him. Meanwhile, Cooper and Mike Alexander are trying to fly the airplane. They make one more pass and they hit the ground. Helicopter flips, kills everybody on board. Everybody's dead. That's why these guys are a little down when I'm coming in all my glee saying, let's go find these Scuds. Well, they worked with me and we did do that. But you know why we did it? To honor the sacrifice made by those 7 men. They died for a reason. They died doing something. They died so that no one kills the children anymore. Now, the war ended. We didn't get the Scuds, but I went on to the United Nations and I worked with Delta Force the entire time I was with the United Nations. They came in and we hunted down, we tried to account for the hundreds of missiles, hundreds or dozens of launchers. I worked with the helicopter pilots, Delta Force. By 1993, I was able to go to the director of the Central Agency and brief him that we could account for all the missiles. Well, the US didn't believe us. They didn't believe us. 1994, I'm in Israel. This is a big deal. Ehud Segei is the director of military intelligence for the Israelis. And while I'm trying to get the Israelis to help us with intelligence information, the Iraqis are making a move on Kuwait, 1994, October. Now he has to go to the prime minister and say, do we issue gas masks to the Israeli people? The last time they did that, old people and children died. Panic. And he's like, so he comes to me and he says, Ritter, you're the Scud guy. I have to go brief the prime minister right now. A decision has to be made tonight. Are there any Scud missiles left in Iraq? Is Israel at threat? And I said, no, sir. Mission accomplished. We accounted for them all. And he went and briefed the prime minister. They didn't issue the gas masks. No more children died. It's like one of the greatest moments of my life. I was so proud, because we accomplished the mission. We gave purpose to the sacrifice made by those 7 men. 2001, I've resigned from the special commission out of protest because the U.S. government was interfering with our work. And we're getting ready to go to war with Iraq again. We're getting ready to go to war with Iraq again. One of the things we're saying is that the Iraqis have Scud missiles. And I'm going, no, they don't. We got rid of them all. Mission accomplished. No more Scuds. But no one's listening. I go to the record store. And there it is, the final cut. But it's the new version. It's not on vinyl anymore. It's on CD. And I'm like, whoa, let me look at it. They had a new song on there, a new song. I said, okay, well, I'm going to listen to this song. It's called When the Tigers Broke Free. Blew my mind. It was dark all around. There was frost on the ground when the tigers broke free. And no one survived. And the Royal Fusiliers, Company Z. They're all left behind, most of them dead, some of them dying. And that's how the high command took my daddy from me. The guy who wrote that song was Roger Waters. Eric Fletcher Rogers was his father, Waters. In 1939, he was a conscientious objector. When the British were mobilizing for war against Germany, he said, I don't do that. I don't fight. And they gave him an exception. But by 1940, he realized what the scourge of Nazism was. He changed his mind. He went to the board and he said, I need to serve my country. And they took him and they commissioned him a second lieutenant in the Royal Fusiliers. On 18 February 1944, in the Battle of Anzio, Company Z was on the front line, holding off the German attack. When the tigers broke free, they were all killed. Roger Waters lost his father in war, never got to know his father. That made me think. I said, my God, Cooper had 2 kids. Mike Alexander, he had 3 kids. Otto Clark, 3 kids. Eloy Rodriguez, 3 kids. The high command took their daddy from them. They died in war. Why? Why did they die? It was supposedly to be the Gardener's dream, a place to sleep, something to eat, a place where old heroes can walk safely down the street, but that wasn't happening. In March of 2003, Delta Force went across the border again into Iraq, chasing phantom Scuds. The war wasn't over. It was all a lie. We didn't accomplish anything. Those men died for nothing. Those children lost their parents, their father for nothing. Cooper can't throw the football with Logan. Rodriguez had a daughter, Deanna. He can't walk her down the aisle when she gets married. They're gone forever. And then I take a look at what's happening today, the Cold War. Take a look at, we had hundreds of thousands of men in Germany. We're ready to go to war, and we brought that down. And yet today, we're back there cheering as we deploy more troops into Europe. USA, USA, cheering the troops. Now we come to the final song from the final cut, Southampton Dock. We disembarked in 45. No one spoke and no one smiled. There were too many spaces in the line. We gathered at the cenotaph and all agreed with hands on heart to sheathe the sacrificial knives. But now she stands on Southampton Dock with her handkerchief and her summer frock, clings to her wet body in the rain, knuckles in quiet desperation, knuckles wide upon the slippery reins, she bravely waves the boys goodbye again. We haven't learned a damn thing. Not a goddamn thing. I'll take any questions you have.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott, so much. So we're going to take questions. Scott's talk reminded me of something that I should have said in the beginning. If we look around and we see all these paintings, they're done by a French painter named Diane Esmond. And when Germany invaded France, they confiscated Nazi Germany some of her paintings, including this one right here, the clown. Nazi Germany had confiscated that painting. So Diane Esmond's son, Victor Wallace, he's a member of this church, and they donated all of these paintings to the church for sale. All proceeds go to the church. So if anyone's interested, they could look around at the paintings. So yes, we're going to take questions. If anybody here in the audience has any questions, yes, just raise your hands and I'll walk over the cordless mic. So we'll go here first.
So thanks, Scott. I remember you well from the run up to the invasion of Iraq when I think you came and spoke here in May of 2002, warning people that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And then after the invasion, it was always interesting to hear people say, nobody knew there weren't any weapons of mass destruction. So thank you for your efforts then. And your amazing, very moving talk tonight. First of all, came in a little bit late. Can there are two different titles here. Can you just say a word about the books that you have available tonight?
Sure.
And what they're about. And then a friend of mine I spoke with who used to work closely with Ralph Nader, he's a left person of Ukrainian background. We've had a number of discussions about the situation in the war. And he wanted me to ask, and I think it's actually a good question, what do you have to say, what's your understanding of the Budapest Memorandum and the whole question of Ukrainian sovereignty and how that plays into all the other, I think, sometimes pretty complicated questions about this current war?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, let's just start off with the two titles. Scorpion King is a history of America's addiction to nuclear weapons from FDR to Donald Trump. And Joe Biden just promulgated the national security strategy of the United States, inclusive of a nuclear posture. And anybody who says, well, this book's outdated, Biden's president, it's not outdated. Biden kept the same nuclear posture review that Donald Trump had in place, even though he campaigned on a promise that he was going to revoke it and pursue what's known as the sole purpose doctrine. The sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter other nations from using nuclear weapons against us. Instead, we have a policy of preemptive use of nuclear weapons in a non-nuclear environment that's very ambiguous, meaning you don't know when we're going to use nukes. Sort of the Nixon madman thing. Richard Nixon was trying to convince the North Vietnamese to come to the Paris peace talk. So he was talking to his chief of staff and he said, let them think I'm crazy. I'm crazy, Richard Nixon. I'm going to nuke them. We're going to nuke them. Let them think I'm going to nuke them. Let them think I'm so damn crazy that they're going to have to go to the peace table. I mean, that's insane, but it's true. That's how he operated. And gosh, Donald Trump at the United Nations, fire and fury is going to rain down on North Korea, threatening to nuke them. It's all right there in this book. It's a history of America's addiction to nuclear weapons. And I think I'm not going to accuse anybody in this audience of this, but when I go out amongst the people, they don't know anything about our nuclear policy. They don't even know what nuclear weapons are. They're not afraid of them. There's not a fear, an inherent fear anymore. They're just like, yeah, nukes, we got nukes. Nukes are good. Turn it into parking lot, turn Iran into a glass, nuke them until they glow. Why? I mean, don't you understand what you're saying? Don't you understand what this is about? And they don't. That's why I wrote the book. And then the second one is Disarmament, the Time of Perestroika. It's about my experience as a weapons inspector. And I say in the Time of Perestroika, and this is sort of the an interesting part of the book. When I arrived in the Soviet Union in June of 1988 to begin the implementation process, Gorbachev was convening something called the 19th All-Party Union Conference. You guys say, well, there's 19 of them, can't be that special. Well, the last one had been convened in June 1941 by Joseph Stalin right before the Germans invaded. They're rare. is a big deal. It's a revolution. He was basically trying to replace the communist way of doing business with this new democracy under the guise of perestroika. He was talking about elections, free elections. People could run who weren't members of the Communist Party. They were going to create something called the Congress of People's Deputies. And then that was going to create something called the Supreme Soviet. And then he would be the president. And it would be this new way of governing, this new approach to everything. And that was perestroika. And we lived in the middle of it. I was an eyewitness to the first elections ever held in the Soviet Union. I was there at the polling place watching it. Not because I was a monitor, I was just a curious inspector. I got kicked out real quick by the town mayor because a couple of drunk people showed up, said, "We can't let you see drunk people vote. You're out of here." But it was a smooth election. Watching democracy, come to life before you was fascinating. And then watching the Soviet Union collapse around you because perestroika didn't work was very depressing. And the interplay between disarmament and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's what the second part of it, arms control, and the end of the Soviet Union. There's a direct relationship between it. I don't want to give away too much or you won't buy the book, but it's there. Look, I'm being facetious. Like every author wants their books to sell, but if I could, I'd give this book away for free because I think the story is so important. The story of hope, the story of history, the story of accomplishment. I mean, what we did was amazing. Building from nothing this multi-million-dollar facility outside of a missile factory. And remember I talked in the beginning, I talked about those majors and lieutenant colonels and colonels. You know who the heroes of the story are? Three captains who shouldn't have been there, but they were there by accident. And it was on their shoulders that much of the heavy lifting fell to save the treaty. And the treaty was at risk. There was a crisis, a missile crisis. And myself, John Sartorius, and Stu O'Neill, the three of us together were able to save the treaty. If it weren't for us, I firmly believe the treaty may very well have collapsed, and that would have been the end of disarmament. So read the book. It's a pretty cool book. Now, you talked about the Budapest Memorandum. What you're talking about, I believe, is the 1994 Budapest Agreement. That basically, here's the myth. The myth is Ukraine had nuclear weapons, and they gave up their nuclear weapons in exchange for an agreement that people would protect them from outside powers like Russia, who had nuclear weapons. That Ukraine, there was a guarantee of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. They're sort of right, but it wasn't that way at all. You see, Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. Straight up never had them. The Soviet Union did. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil. And the Soviets said, if you even think about taking control, or the Russians said, don't even think about taking control of them. You don't get to have nuclear weapons. We own them. We have the passive codes that prevent them from being used. If you try to take possession of them, we'll kill you all. We're not going to let it happen. But they were on Ukrainian soil. And so Ukraine ostensibly, had possession of them. So the question is, how do you get rid of them? And so there was this whole negotiating process about how to get rid of these nuclear weapons. At the end of the day, everybody's saying Ukraine gave these up, and by doing so, they turned their sovereign protection over to the world. Guys, it was an embezzlement scheme from the start. Ukraine was leveraging these nuclear weapons, which they didn't possess, couldn't use. They were useless to them, but they were making a stink out of it, trying to get as much money as possible from the United States. This was an extortion racket from day one. And anybody who thinks other, read the history of it, read the negotiating record, see what the truth is. I'll debate this one till I'm blue in the face because I know I'm right. Ukraine is a corrupt nation then. It's an even more corrupt nation today. Nothing happens out of the goodness of anybody's heart in Ukraine, especially if you're a government official. You're on the take, you're taking money, it's all corruption. And someday somebody's going to answer the question of how $50+ billion of US taxpayer money was expended in Ukraine, where it went, to whom it went, what was accomplished with it. But that's what the Budapest. Yeah, I know. I understand what you're saying. Gosh, don't hold a coup. Okay, if you want to have territorial integrity and you have a constitution elected president named Viktor Yanukovych, and you're going to believe in constitutional rule of law, and that attaches to all the treaties you enter in, don't have a coup. Don't illegally overthrow the president with neo-Nazis come in and start murdering Russians. Don't stuff 150 people into a building and set it on fire and laugh as 48 of them die. Don't run into Mariupol and rape women in the streets, repeating what happened in Lvov and broadcast it and film it and brag about it. Because when you do that, I'm sorry, man, you lose sovereign rights. And Russia's going to act in a way Russia needs to act to protect itself. And that's what Russia has done. Let's not pretend that what happened between February 2014 and April 2014 was all, songs and flowers and dancing in the streets. It was rape. It was murder. It was torture by the Ukrainian nationalists against the ethnic Russians of Ukraine. And when you engage in that, I'm sorry, you can't sit there and say, oh, I'm protected by the Budapest Memorandum. No, you're not. You're a Nazi regime, and you reap what you sow. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, thank you so much. I'm a pacifist, but I have utmost respect for you. You are a soldier, and you have been able to. You're here talking with us, and it's pretty amazing. This is really a testament to human nature and communication. So, thank you so much. Can you explain a little bit why the current? I don't know if it's like the border of Ukraine in February 2022. Sorry. Why did it include both Ukrainian-speaking and Russian-speaking people? So how did it come to be like these two completely different group of people living together? And clearly there was a lot of animosity. Well, when they voted completely along language lines. So it was clearly there was something going on there. So how did they come to be in the same country?
Well, according to Vladimir Putin, it's all Lenin's fault. Blame Lenin, you see, because when the formation of the Soviet Union took place, this territory that was called Ukraine, a lot of people, including Stalin, said, we don't want that. We don't want artificial nationalities, because what was Ukraine? It's not homogeneous. In order to make Ukraine what it is, they had to append economically viable regions where the Russians were the majority. Historically, Russian areas were now appended to this thing they were calling Ukraine to create the notion of, a Soviet of nationalities. This was Lenin's big thing. Then you take a look at the part of Ukraine that is in the West. The history of that. Russia, during World War I, this Galicia was fought over between the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians, and and you had a group of people there where Stepan Bandera came from that believed it should be independent. It should be Ukraine, and it should be linked to, a central Ukraine that included Kiev, but it never talked about including this Russian area. They don't like Russians. They didn't want the Russians. But at the end of World War I, there was the history's complicated. There was the Soviet-Polish War. A lot of people forget about that war. They forget that the Budyani's cavalry army was charging across the steppes, drove all the way up to Warsaw, and then there's the miracle on the Vistula, where the Sikorsky and the Poles led a counterattack that actually drove all the way to Kiev. But the peace treaty pushed them back, but gave them the territorial lines of what we call Western Ukraine today. Lvov and other cities were part of Poland until 1939. And then Germany invaded Poland, and because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop treaty, the secret deal that was cut, the Soviets came in behind, and they split Poland in half. And a big chunk of Poland became part of the Soviet Union. When Germany invaded in 1941, they took that back and brought it back into this Polish governing area. But when the Soviets counterattacked at the end of the war, they brought it back and they reincorporated it into the territory. They made it part of Ukraine. So now Ukraine has the eastern part and the southern part, which is primarily Russian. You have the western part, which are these Ukrainian nationalists that don't want to be part of the Soviet Union. And then you got the central part where you have what I would call the real Ukrainians, people who, you know, around Kiev and the rump. So you have three different Ukraines. Some people say there's more because you have, you know, Hungarians, you know, part of Hungary was attached to it, part of Romania was attached to it. So you have some other minorities, but by and large, you have these three things that exist. And then in 1956, I believe, Khrushchev made it even more complicated because there was a contract being signed, and because Crimea was part of Russia, the Russian Federation, the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, the contract that was signed with the Ukrainian was virtually the same as the Russian, and the guy that was signing it got angry, and he went to Khrushchev and said, "Why do I have to execute two identical contracts for the same thing?" And Khrushchev said, "No problem. Crimea is it's Ukraine now, so your contract just applies." I mean, that's the story I heard. It may be something more complicated, but Ukraine gifted, or Khrushchev gifted Crimea to Ukraine, even though Crimea is populated overwhelmingly by Russians and has a naval base. But this is back in the Soviet Union where they weren't worried about this because Moscow ruled everything anyways. But then when the Soviet Union collapsed, you have this artificial entity called Ukraine that emerges. And inside Ukraine, you have a competition between the old Soviets in the Kiev area, the Russians in the eastern part, and these Western Ukrainian nationalists who they all three have a different vision on what's going to make Ukraine work. Ukraine collapsed into the same anarchy, chaos, corruption that Russia did. Even worse, I traveled to Ukraine in 1997 with the United Nations trying to track down a Ukrainian arms dealer who was taking weapons capability from Ukraine, selling it to Iraq on the black market. And we're trying to get the Ukrainian government to stop it. And I'm just going to tell you that the week I spent in Kiev was one of the most disappointing weeks of my life because I was threatened. They tried to bribe me. They tried to do everything. They were going to give me money so I could intervene in the United States. They were doing everything except helping me do my job. And so I walked away from Ukraine saying, this is a fundamentally broken place and nothing's happened that makes me change my assessment of that. But that's what's going on today. This is why, look, I'm sure you can get a Ukrainian up here who will tell you a different version. He'll talk about the unity of Ukraine, et cetera. But how do you overcome the fact that the Russians and the Western Ukrainians will never be able to live together in peace? Why would you put them in the same country knowing that this is never going to be resolved except through violence? And the violence is being perpetrated by the Western Ukrainians on the Russians. Even as we speak, they're murdering Russian prisoners of war. They're executing Russian citizens or Russian speakers who stayed behind. They're being pulled out of their homes, taken to the woods, and the Banderists are doing what Banderists do: killing people, murdering people, raping people, torturing people. I don't know how Ukraine survives this, but you know, the Russians have solved half the problem because those Russian-speaking areas are no longer in Ukraine. They're Russia. They had a referendum. I know, sham referendum, didn't follow international law. Tell that to the Russians in Article 64 of the Russian Constitution. They are convinced that this is Mother Russia now, and they're going to treat it as Mother Russia. And everybody who lives in those territories are being told you are forever part of Russia. And I believe that that's actually what it's going to be. And if the Ukrainians aren't careful and don't come up with a negotiated settlement, they may lose Odessa, they may lose Kharkov, they may lose other areas where there are significant Russian-speaking populations. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Okay, great. We're gonna take a question from online. I want to take a moment to thank Charlie Welch and Grady behind the computer and Dean Stevens, who made all the video audio tech work. Thanks to their efforts, we have over I think 2,000 people watching live right now. So next up, we're going to take a question from Charlie Welch, former president of Community Church.
It's not my question. I'm reading a question from the chat on Zoom. Somebody's asking what your opinion of the development of autonomous killer weapons is.
Of the what?
Autonomous killer weapons.
Autonomous killer weapons. Robots, I guess?
Yeah, exactly.
Killer drones. You know, I'm an old school Marine. So when we killed, we did it up close and personal. Or the old-fashioned way with artillery or calling it an airstrike. But this concept of artificial intelligence is new to me. I follow it as closely as I can, but I can't say that I have firsthand experience with autonomous killer drones or, you know, things of that nature. I'm concerned. Somebody who believes that if you're going to go to war, that command and control is absolutely essential, that leadership does matter, and the human factor is paramount, especially if you're talking about international humanitarian law and the absolute requirement for men and women in combat conditions not to allow the heat of the moment to overcome them and have them commit crimes. I think that you have to have very good leadership, very good training, and that there must be a human link in this. So I'm not a fan of allowing life and death decisions to be transferred over to inanimate. I guess they're not inanimate because they move, but it's a problem when you let a Marine speak. You're using a word you don't understand. I know, but when you allow these autonomous artificial intelligence devices to make life and death decisions, I just think it's wrong. I oppose it. I know why people want to do it. I mean, for instance, in the explosive ordnance disposal thing, I would prefer, if I were an EOD tech, not to be putting on the suit, walking up to the device and, you know, playing, you know, casino, hoping that I've made the right choice and I don't blow up. It would be nice to be able to get a robot in there that I could direct, but see, the robot's doing what I tell it to do. It's not making its own decisions. You know, technology is wonderful. You know, Patrick Hurley, the guy I talked about, you know, today, what they would have done is flown in a team with a whole setup where they would be broadcasting his injuries to a team in Bethesda of doctors who would be sitting around looking at it and telling the medic what to do, you know, what, you know, and so they could, you know, start saving lives right up front. Technology is awesome, but we should never let technology replace the human being when it comes to life and death decisions. That's just where I stand on that.
Great, thanks, Charlie, and thanks everyone on Zoom. Okay, we'll go this way.
Okay.
So we'll start with Bella.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Scott, thank you so much for what you've done and what you are still doing, not only for the United States, for the entire world. And I had a question that I actually sent you on Telegram, but I understand you have lots of followers there. Something that I heard that took me aback a little bit from the person I respected. Do you know Konstantin Sivkov? He's a doctor of military science.
Do I know what?
Konstantin Sivkov?
Konstantin
Sivkov.
No.
He is a doctor of military science, very prominent figure in Moscow. Something he mentioned about disarmament, and that's why I sent you this video immediately. He said that disarmament, by the way, I'm not agree with this point, was the crime against humanity, because his reasoning was that we had so many nuclear weapons between Russia and United States that everyone were afraid of nuclear winter. Or right now we are at the level that some people think, like Nulands and Blinkings, like that, okay, we can experiment with what would, I would like to argue with him. I am not an expert, you are. I really wanted to.
So he's saying that disarmament is a crime against humanity.
Yes, because it was actually a break. People were, countries were afraid because we had so many. They realized the consequences that now. I get the question. I think. Again, not that I agree with you.
No, I understand. But I have to tell you, you know, I'm somebody who believes in disarmament. I believe in it wholeheartedly, especially, you know, knowing what nuclear weapons are and what nuclear weapons can do. I believe disarmament. I believe in zero nuclear weapons. I don't think there's a reason. These are the most horrible weapons man has ever made. And I can't think of any legitimate reason to use nuclear weapons, especially in a age where once we use them, they can be used against us, and there's no guarantee that we can interdict them in the world. You know, we've done this before. I know there's people out there right now in the U.S. government, all these young whippersnappers, and they're like, no, we can build missile defense. So we can build missile defense, and then we can shoot down their missiles, and we can build this first strike capability that can go in there, precision strike, take them out. Anything that's left comes in, we shoot it down. We can win a nuclear war. I'm like, dude, read my book. You can't. We already did that. We tried that once. It doesn't work. It will never work. Whatever defense you have will not last, and probably won't last the moment you make it, because the other side is building something offensively that can overcome it. And then we just repeat the cycle over and over again till we bankrupt ourselves, building more and more weapons to what threshold? That's why the first real arms control wasn't reduction, it was limitation, the strategic arms limitation talks. We're talking about limiting how many we could build by what types, but we're still building more and more and more. You know, this whole concept of the better defense, that's why we had the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Because we recognize that if we think we can build a missile that shoots down missiles, they'll just build a missile that can overcome our missile that shoots down missiles. So we have to build a new missile to shoot down missiles, and we just do it over and over again. That the best thing to avoid nuclear war was to recognize that if you fought nuclear war, we would all die, mutually assured destruction. And that way we sat there and went, yep, we can't use them, because if we use them, they use them, we all die. And then we said, okay, if that's the case, why do we need so many? Then we began strategic arms reduction talks to bring it down. But what made it work was two sides that respected one another. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States stopped respecting Russia, and we stopped treating arms control seriously. So I understand where a Russian could come in and say that the American approach to disarmament is not real disarmament, because it's about giving the United States unilateral advantages over others. It isn't about the equal reduction of capability. It's about sustaining an American superiority and preventing other nations being able to reach what we have, to weaken other nations while keeping us strong. That's our approach. And if I were him, I would view that as a crime against humanity, because it creates the notion that the United States can fight and win a nuclear war. That's why we have a policy that says we can consider using nuclear weapons first, preemptively. That's why we built a new category of nuclear weapons called the low-yield warhead, the W76-2, that we actually put on a Trident missile on an Ohio-class submarine, and in 2020 tested it in a war game where we fired it against the Russians. We weren't even hiding what we were doing. And the Russians are looking at it going, what? You guys are playing a war game where you're firing a nuclear weapon at us. What do you think we're going to do? Well, Putin's gone on record and said, this is why we had to build these new weapons. We had to build all these new weapons because of you. And he said, you know, you didn't listen to us when we said, don't withdraw from the ABM treaty. You didn't listen to us when we said, don't withdraw from the INF treaty. You didn't listen to us when we said, take strategic arms seriously, arms reduction seriously. Then he gave his little Scarface thing. Meet my little friend. You know, are you listening now? He actually said that. Are you listening now? And some people are, but there's other people going, yeah, but we'll just build a better, and they start this whole stupid cycle again. So I know where the guy's coming from. And from his perspective, he's right. But here's the thing. He has to understand that if there is a nuclear war, we're all going to die anyways. Okay, so now is that really the outcome we want? Do we want to sustain a paradigm that has America thinking that we can fight and win a nuclear war, when the reality is the moment we start a nuclear war, we all die? Do we want to sustain that? And the answer is no. So I would tell him, you're a dead man anyways. You're a dead man walking just like I am. And the only way we solve this is through disarmament. And I agree, it can't be one-sided, America controls everything. It has to be mutual. It has to be with respect. It has to be what we did here, or else don't do it. But that's the direction we should be heading. I reject any notion that we should not be doing everything humanly possible to enter into meaningful disarmament talks with the Russians and the Chinese and anybody else who has nuclear weapons to get those weapons out of here. Nuclear weapons can never be allowed to be used ever. Bottom line.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for maybe 3-4 more questions. Okay, so we'll go here next. Hold the mic.
I've been having quite a problem because I'm from Lexington. I mean, I was from Lexington. I go to the senior center there and I talk to these people, and I'm defending Russia. Because from the time, let's say back when I was 12 years old, when the war, Second World War was being fought, when the Chetniks, the Serbs, and the Greeks were the only ones with the Russians that were against the Germans. Most of those other countries, half of NATO right now, were with the Germans. And this is what really, so I've been collecting items out of the papers from the last 30, 40 years. I have copies here, I'll show them to you, where, especially when you talked about how, what we did, Gorbachev, that man was a beautiful man, yet we double-crossed him. And when I bring these things up, they don't want to hear about it. They'll talk 10, 20, 30 minutes on something like this. When I'm talking, they'll cut me off. But this is it's absolutely disgusting. And when you talked about how we interfered with their election, Stephen Kinzer, a few years ago, had a very nice article about how the one who got Putin in there was Bill Clinton. Because what he pushed to get Yeltsin in there. Then when Yeltsin got so drunk and sick that he picked Putin in his place. And like you're saying, Putin, I feel that same way about Putin. That guy was the only person that was a straight guy trying to do what's right. So I'm so happy I got a little more information now that I can use now when I go. It's a helpless clause, but I feel it's worth it.
I agree, sir. I'm going to issue a green flare, and next time you're there and they give you a problem, fire it. Send in the Marines. We'll come in. I'm your reinforcements. Not violence. I'm not talking about violence. I'm talking about debate, discussion, dialogue, the things that make America a great country. And let me just put it this way. It's a shame what they're doing to you, because it's okay to disagree. I mean, you disagree with them and they have every right to disagree with you. But what makes America great, one of my favorite paintings, I know I'm telling you all this stupid stuff about me, is a Norman Rockwell painting. And it's a freedom of speech. It's about the 4 freedoms, but it's the one where the guy is in the church and he's speaking. And you know he believes it because you see in his eyes. He believes what he's saying, but he's not a radical. He looks like he's calm. And everybody around him are looking at him, listening to him. And you know someone want to get up and speak after him and say why they disagree. But they're giving him the space to talk. They're respecting his opinion. And that's what makes America great. Not that we all agree. It's that we should all agree to disagree civilly. That what makes this country work is our ability to have debate, discussion, and dialogue about complicated issues, put it out there for everybody to consider. They empower themselves with this knowledge and information, and they overcome prejudices. They overcome the fear that's derived from ignorance. Knowledge is power, and what you're doing is trying to empower your fellow citizens with knowledge so they make a better informed decision. And frankly speaking, they're bad Americans for not letting you finish the job. They think they're pro-American, but any American who's about cancel culture, silence opposition, don't allow people to speak, they're not good Americans. You let everybody have their voice, and then you have a chance to respond. And the strength of the argument should win out. We should respect the average American's intelligence enough to know that if both sides put an argument out there and yours has more fact, yours is more reasoned, et cetera, then you'll prevail. And we hope that people will vote that way. That's what democracy is about. We come up, we talk about things, and in the end, we put it to a vote. And if I made the better pitch, I get more votes. Then we move forward. But that doesn't mean that you're wrong. It means that you sit there and go, okay, you got me this time, but now next time I'm going to listen to what you do. Ritter, you're wrong there. Ritter, you're wrong. Trust me, I'm wrong on a lot. And then you'll be able to come up and say, Ritter was wrong about all this. This is my new platform, my new pitch. And people go, yeah, we're going to vote for you now. And they'll vote for you, but now you're on the firing line. That's what makes this country great, is that the elected officials are held accountable for what they do by the people who put them in there. But you can't hold people to account if you silence debate. And I shame on them for silencing you. Shame on them.
Okay, great. We're going to go next to my friend and prominent member of Mass Peace Action, Eva Mosley. Eva has her own book out.
Thank you. Thank you for that plug. You may remember me, we used to come here. You came, we were protesting the Iraq War across the street.
No, yeah.
And you joined us.
I did.
Then we all came here.
Yeah.
And got to like you, even though you were a Marine.
I know.
So my question is about Gorbachev. Gorbachev has always been my hero, but for some reason he failed. And my impression was, and you know, I'm really old and I have trouble remembering stuff, that the US abandoned Gorbachev and fixed on Yeltsin, who was a thug, as far as I can see. Is that right? Or am I being sentimental about Gorbachev?
Well, I think, first of all, Gorbachev was a Soviet politician. So he came up through the ranks, you know, as a Soviet bureaucrat with all that entails. He was a regional power figure. His thing for him that he was young at a time when, you know, the Soviets had dealt with Brezhnev, and then they had Andropov, and then Chernenko, and they're like, oh my God. And there was supposed to be somebody who was supposed to take Chernenko's place who was old, and Gorbachev said, nope, I'm it. I'm the young guy. We're the new blood. He had a vision, and you got to respect that vision. I think he looked at the Soviet Union and said, this isn't working. It's not working the way it needs to work. So he had a vision. The problem wasn't the vision, so to speak. It was the implementation of the vision. Gorbachev talked the talk about democracy, but didn't walk the walk. I mean, one of the big problems early on, what caused a big split with Yeltsin, was that well, Gorbachev said we're going to have an election to vote in this Congress of People's Deputies, and then those elected people are going to vote to create this Supreme Soviet. I'm going to appoint myself president. It's like, whoa, dude, wait. Democracy. You know, why don't you? Because the second you do that, you delegitimize this whole notion of the power of the people. But Gorbachev's had an idea, but he didn't trust the idea. That's the problem. And he was an imperfect salesman for the idea, especially on the economy. He got ahead of himself on the economy, brought in some new thinkers. He was talking about, you know, transitioning from this centrally planned 5-year plan defense industry focused economy into, you know, more of a free market, you know, converted economy with, you know, civilian products. But I talk about this a lot in this book. Vodkinsk was a missile town. Vodkinsk was run by the Vodkinsk Production Association, the Vodkinsk factory, and they built missiles. And they received their money from those missiles, and they paid the salaries of the people from those missiles. They ran the schools, they paved the roads, they built the buildings. Everything happened because it came from the Vodkinsk machine building plant, who got its money by building missiles. Gorbachev was about defense conversion. The first thing that happened to Vodkinsk is they got rid of the INF missiles, the SS-20. They made a lot of money making SS-20s. They had a whole new SS-20 in production. They actually had, like, I think 64 disassembled missiles in the factory when the treaty came that never got to be built. Therefore, they never got paid for them. They built the SS-12, not anymore. The SS-23, not anymore. The only missile they were allowed to build was the SS-25 and this other missile called the Courier. It's a short ICBM. It was under development. So they went from this factory that produced 6 different kinds of missiles to a factory that's producing 2 kinds, one that's in serial production, the other one that's in research and development. They lost all that money. And yet now the town is sitting there going, the school has a leaky roof. We don't got any money to repair that roof. The road needs paved. We don't have any money to pave the road. We don't build missiles anymore. And Gorbachev saying, convert to civilian industry. The two big civilian products, they had three. One was a baby carriage. How many baby carriages do you have to build to equal one missile? The answer is you can't build enough. And yet they're saying, build more baby carriages. They build a washing machine, the FEA. Anybody ever use a FEA? Don't. Okay. It's not a good washing machine, but they built the FEA. But how many FEAs do you have to build to compensate for a missile? You can't. You can't do it. There's no compensation taking place. So they made the adjustments. They did produce these machine tools, the CNCs, computerized numerical controllers, that do precise machining. The problem is the machine tools that they built, the best ones, were built specifically for missiles. So they're top secret. So they can't release that technology to be sold. They can only sell to the public the stuff that ain't that good, and it can't compete with the West. So even when they tried to put a machine tool on the market, it couldn't compete with the West, so no income coming in. It came down to these two missiles, the SS-25 and the Courier. And one of the things that brought down the Soviet Union, and I explain it for the first time in this book, is this small ICBM. They needed to put that into serial production to get the income in. One of the guys that was running for election in the Vodkinsk region was the Minister of Defense Industry. And he was promising them, if you vote for me, I'm going to keep the small ICBM. But Gorbachev saying, nope, we need to get rid of it because of strategic arms reduction. We need to continue to reduce these things. And we have to give in to the United States. See, by this time, the United States, Reagan had left, George W. Bush was in, and Bush was hesitating, jumping on the Gorbachev bandwagon. Gorbachev's advisors are saying, we need investment, direct investment. We're getting rid of all these things that you want us to get rid of, but we need somebody to come in and invest so we can have jobs, have money, and we can pay people, and the economy's working. And Bush, just hold off on that. We're going to think about it for a little bit. And Gorbachev is moving straight ahead with these reforms, but the economy is collapsing around him, and the United States not stepping up to help him. And Gorbachev kept pushing for disarmament. As we come to this point. And finally he said, we're going to get rid of the small ICBM. And the Vodkinsk people said, the hell you are. That's what lets me eat. You get rid of this missile. You know, we don't have enough money to live at this point in time. And Gorbachev signed it. Well, the first thing that happened is that the military, they kept the missile going in secret. And then when Gorbachev found out about it, he got furious, started threatening to fire people. And but they kept the missile going anyways. And finally, they got to the point where they confronted Gorbachev and they wrote this memorandum that said, we need you to sign this memorandum so we can start testing this missile, so we can start producing this missile. And that memorandum went on the desk. Gorbachev refused to sign it, send it back. That took place 2 days before Gorbachev flew to Crimea for his vacation in August of 1991. When Gorbachev flew away, Khrushchev, the KGB head, had his little sauna meeting where he brought all the people in. Most of the names that were gathered in that room were the people who sent that letter to Gorbachev. Gorbachev's refusal to sign that letter was the straw that broke the camel's back. Disarmament was everything. And Gorbachev tried to appease the United States by getting rid of these weapons without getting anything in return. He was left hanging. They didn't sign the START treaty until July 31st, 1991. 17 days later was the coup. Too little, too late. Was Gorbachev the perfect leader? No. But, you know, he was never really given a chance. The United States failed. George W. Bush failed. We had an ambassador, Jack Matlock, at the time. Matlock was writing memorandum after memorandum back to Washington, D.C., saying, got to help this guy, got to give him something. He needs something, he needs help. Nothing. George W. Bush did nothing.
Okay, we're closely approaching 8, so we're going to take 2 more questions, one from Cole and one from the gentleman I promised earlier. So next, let's go to Cole. Cole Harrison, the Executive Director of Massachusetts Peace Action.
Thanks, Scott. I think you're great talk. I think you're absolutely right that the U.S. Expanded NATO all the way up to Russia and has been squeezing Russia all this time. Absolutely right. I think your analysis of the Ukraine war is wrong, though. Ukraine does not lose its sovereignty just because it has some Nazis within it. It does not lose its sovereignty because it has different ethnic groups within it that are at odds. Many countries have Nazis. Many countries have ethnic groups that are at odds. They don't lose their sovereignty. Even if there's a coup in that country, they don't lose their sovereignty. Ukraine is still a member state of the United Nations. It's a founding member of the United Nations, and Russia had no right to invade it. The Russian-speaking people in Ukraine do have a problem. They have had a problem, but you don't solve it by trying to negate the sovereignty of another country. But my question for you is, how are we going to get out of this thing? What are the interests on each side? What are the interests in the US, NATO, Russia, Ukraine? How are we going to end this war? Because Ukraine is being laid waste to, and as you have pointed out, there's every risk of a wider war by escalating. We just saw this incident with the missile that fell in Poland the other day. Fortunately, people investigated it and didn't go to war over it, but they easily could have. And so how do we get out of this?
Well, let me just start with responding. I respect your analysis, but here's the problem I have with it. What about Kosovo in 1999? Okay, let's just stop right now. Because what Russia articulated, their reason for going to war, was articulated under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. So let's stop pretending Russia broke the law. They didn't. Russia exhausted every venue possible to prevent this war. They wanted the Minsk Accords to be implemented. They looked the Germans and the French in the eye in November and said, please pressure the Ukrainians. They said no. They went to Joe Biden, June 2021 in Geneva, begged him, please pressure the Ukrainians to implement Minsk. He said no. We now know why. Peter Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, stood up and said, it's a sham. I'm using this to buy time to build a NATO-trained army so that I can invade the Donbass and get rid of these pesky Russians here. And when I say get rid of, kill them. Kill them. This is the same president that bragged about how Ukrainian children were going to go to kindergarten, but the Russian children in the Donbass were going to cower in their basements while they get blown away by the Ukrainian artillery. I have a problem saying that these guys have a right to anything, but when they start to threaten an invasion and they amass 60 to 100,000 NATO-trained forces, we were training them from 2015 at a NATO base run by the United States in Western Ukraine. Every 55 days, we cranked out a battalion of 500 to 600 Ukrainian soldiers, trained and equipped the NATO standards, and sent them east to kill Russians. And the Russians know about it. And yet they still tried to have a diplomatic off-ramp. Russia finally couldn't put up with it. Now, here's the problem. How does Russia invade Ukraine? They can't under international law, not permitted. So Lugansk and Donetsk held a referendum. They declared independence. Russia recognized that independence, and then Russia entered into a collective security agreement with them. So now you have three nations working together in collective security, and now the Ukrainian threat to invade Lugansk and Donetsk is now a threat against all three. Russia cited Article 51, preemptive, collective self-defense, and people go, well, that's just a little too cute, Scott. No, it's exactly what NATO and the United States did to justify intervening in Serbia and NATO. The Russians did the exact same legal argument. So Russia didn't do anything wrong. Well, gosh, I don't know. The United Nations passed a Chapter 7 resolution back in 1990 authorizing the United States to lead a military force to liberate Kuwait. But to liberate Kuwait, we had to conduct a strategic air campaign against all of Iraq to destroy their ability to wage war, including putting forces on the ground in Western Iraq and doing a left hook up through Southern Iraq. Come on, man. War is war. Once you say you're going to use military force, you use military force. They didn't take Kiev, but what they did do is freeze 80,000 Ukrainian troops in place that couldn't be diverted to the east. It was called a feint. The same thing they did off Odessa. You know, the Russians, again, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that they're perfect, but they didn't just go in and, you know, aggressively, preemptively, without justification, violate Ukraine's rights. Ukraine had every opportunity to prevent this war from happening. They opted out of that opportunity, and now they pay the price. You say you can't annex it, then why do we support the Israeli annexation of the Golan? Why do we do that? There has to be consistency in policy, and there is no consistency in policy, and because the Russians have done everything in accordance with the rule of law. You can say the law is wrong, but you can't say the Russians are violating international law. Now, how do we get out of this? The Russians have built a playbook. They put forward a draft treaty on December 17th of last year. They presented that draft treaty to NATO and the United States. It talks about a new European security framework. Everybody can go, oh my God, that's surrender. They want surrender, the dissolution of NATO. No, they don't. They're not asking for the dissolution of NATO. In fact, they say NATO can exist. We have no problem with NATO the way it's currently configured. You can't have Ukraine. That ain't going to happen because that's in our sphere of interest. But it's amazing. America can have spheres of interest, the Monroe Doctrine. But Russia's not allowed to have a sphere of influence or sphere of interest. But what the Russians have said is that they want this new European security framework that demilitarizes a zone in the center part of Europe to back NATO off from Russia and Russia off. Now, wow, we had something. It was called the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the CFE Treaty. It was done back when the Soviet Union was there. And we said, let's pull it back. You know why it didn't work? Because NATO expanded into the Baltics and then told Russia, we can't incorporate these new NATO armies in there because they weren't there when the treaty was originally written. And Russia's going, wait a minute, you've just expanded to my border. And now you're telling me that the treaty that's supposed to reduce the conventional threat doesn't apply to their militaries right on my border? Are you high? And they got out of the treaty. Now, this new European security framework should include a new conventional forces in Europe thing that withdraws forces back here like Russia wants, but Russia will also have to withdraw forces back. Maybe Russia reduces its military presence in Kaliningrad, which Poland and the Baltics fear. Reduce that, but Russia won't do that as long as you have big armies around them. But if the armies calm down, Russia calms down, things pull back. The ABM treaty, sign it again. Get rid of these missile sites in Poland and Romania. Get rid of them. They don't need to exist. Get rid of them. The INF Treaty. We don't need to have the 53rd Artillery Brigade, which was a Pershing II brigade back in the Cold War, reactivated, which we just did last year. And we're going to deploy something called the Dark Eagle hypervelocity missile into Europe next year that can strike Moscow within 5 minutes, recreating the entire thing that brought up the INF crisis to begin with. A new INF treaty. Arms control is the key. We sit down with the Russians and we renegotiate these treaties. We breathe life back into the ABM Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, and we implement this new European security framework that the Russians are just begging people to talk about. What's interesting is there was a letter put out by 30 progressive Democrats a little while ago. It was a ridiculous letter, but what was interesting there is that in that letter, they said, we need a negotiated settlement that includes consideration of a new European security framework. So people are starting to wake up to the idea that what Russia was putting on the table in December might be something we have to start considering. But this isn't going to happen. This is where I'm going to be the big downer here. Anybody that thinks right now that Russia is going to go to the negotiating table with Ukraine still a viable state, it isn't going to happen. This war is going to go on until Ukraine is defeated unconditionally. And only at that point will Russia sit down with the Europeans. So the Americans and the Europeans are going to have to figure out how to deal with that reality. You see them waking up right now. A lot of people are talking about a negotiated settlement. Remember, we weren't a little while ago. Jan Stoltenberg was saying this will be solved on the battlefield. How's that working for you, Jan? Russia's got 220,000 troops coming next month, 10 to 15 divisions worth of troops. Ukraine just burned through everything NATO built up over the summer. They got nothing left. Ukraine's disappearing as a modern nation state. Their electrical grid's gone, no energy. They're freezing to death. How's that working, Jan? Because next month, this whole game's going to change, ladies and gentlemen, when those 10 to 15 divisions shows up and Ukraine's got nothing in response. That's the reality. Russia's not going to concede that. They didn't mobilize 300,000 troops just to give them away. Russia tried on April 1st in Istanbul to meet with the Ukrainians and negotiate a deal that had independence for the Donbass and Russian control of the Crimea, nothing else. And they were willing to put that on the table and talk about it. And the Ukrainians were at the table and they were ready to accept it when NATO said no, because somebody in NATO said, the Russians aren't doing well. The fact that they want to negotiate is a sign of weakness. Therefore, we're going to continue this war so that we bleed the Russians dry. I'm not making this up. Lloyd Austin spoke about it when he came out of Kiev in April, May. He said, our purpose right now is to bring pain to the Russians, to hurt them so bad, to inflict so much harm on them that they will never again consider doing anything of this nature. Russia listened very closely to what he said, and the Russian response is clear. The only one feeling pain here is going to be Ukraine. That's it. I mean, Russia will not negotiate. I can't speak for Russia. I'm just telling you, after listening to everything they've been saying, this war ends when all the conditions set forth by the special military operation are met. Demilitarization, that means the elimination of all NATO influence in Ukraine, and the fact that Ukrainian military today is nothing but a proxy of the NATO. That means the entire military has to be eliminated, and denazification. And when the Russians call the Zelensky regime a Nazi regime, it means Zelensky must go. I think Zelensky's going to end up going sooner rather than later. I think this ridiculous thing in Poland has made him an embarrassment to the West. And there's a lot of talk now that they're trying to bring up the chief of staff of the Ukrainian armed forces and make him some sort of superstar that can take it over. But look, you know, it's tough. I'm with you in terms of the heart. I mean, we can't have a world where nations invade other nations and rip them apart. We can't have that world. That's a bad world to be in. But you can't view what Russia's doing solely from that lens. Russia was compelled to do what it does because of the history of American and NATO expansion. This was an existential issue for Russia. They literally exhausted every effort possible short of war to resolve this peacefully, and they were left with only this option. And even once they executed this option, they tried to negotiate a settlement on April 1st that simply gave independence to the Donbass, recognized Crimea as Russia, and everything else would be Ukraine. And that wasn't good enough for NATO. So now the world's going to have to deal with the results. There's 4 provinces of former Ukraine that will never be Ukraine again. Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. They will never be Ukraine again. And if this war continues, you can add Odessa, you can add Kharkov, probably Dnipropetrovsk, Mikhail also. That's 4 more. They lost 20% of their territory, and if the war continues, they'll lose 20% more, including access to the sea, which means Ukraine will disappear as a modern economic power because they have no access to the sea. Is this what NATO wants? We have to stop talking about what Russia's doing and start asking ourselves, what is NATO's objective? Because the objective of bleeding the Russians until they can no longer do something isn't working. Russia's got 220,000 troops ready, preparing for war, and NATO's got nothing to respond to it. The choice isn't Russia to negotiate their way out of this problem. The choice right now is the West to negotiate their way out of this problem, and I don't see the West doing it.
Okay, we're going to take one more question and then transition over to book signings. Okay, so I want to thank one more time Brady and Charlie Welsh and Dean Stevens and all of Community Church of Boston and Tori for joining us, helping with the book signing, and my dad. My dad is here. My mom was going to come, but we told her Scott was on the Ukrainian kill list, so she's watching from home. Okay.
Smart woman.
Keep going like this, not this.
Two questions, or just one, but the Treaty of Westphalia is very important with national sovereignty. But my question addresses the factor of like a dirty bomb in Ukraine and then the bioweapons labs that were destroyed by, and are they all gone?
Yeah, I'll start with the bioweapons labs because that's more complicated. When the Soviet Union collapsed and broke up into the constituent republics that are today, they had viable chemical weapons programs, biological weapons programs, nuclear weapons programs that needed to be properly dealt with. And they needed help. Their economy was garbage. So the United States stepped in with something called the Nunn-Lugar Act, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Act. And we put hundreds of millions, eventually billions of dollars into helping Russia get rid of these weapons and helping the former Soviet republics like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Georgia, also manage these issues. And that's all fine and dandy. That's good. But here's the problem. Once you manage the W&D issue, what do you do with the scientists? You see, because the economies aren't viable. They can't offer these people employment. And the fear was that these people with this knowledge of how to produce these weapons would go off and help rogue nations develop this. So we needed to create employment vehicles. And that's where the Defense Threat Reduction Agency came in. And they would not only take over former biological weapons facilities, but they would build new biological research facilities. And this was seen as an employment vehicle to keep these scientists gainfully employed. But how do you keep them gainfully employed? What do they do? You can't have them doing high school experiments. They need to be doing something that, you know, keeps their minds working, makes them feel like they're still viable. In the United States, the light went off when I was doing weapons inspection in Iraq. We accused the Iraqis of violating their obligations to get rid of all biological weapons programs, because at every major police center or intelligence center in the country, they had a biological lab. It was a forensic lab that could do detailed forensic biological work, the kind that we have all over. You know, there's, I forget where Massachusetts now, but in New York, near Albany, there's a big facility where New York State does all their biological research related to crimes. And the Iraqis had it, but we came in and said, nope, all of that together gives you the potential to produce biological weapons. So it's prohibited and you must get rid of it. And we blame them for violating everything. And yet, you remember when I showed up at the park, what I was wearing? My firefighter jacket? I was proud of being a firefighter. I'm a little old to be a firefighter right now, but I was a firefighter. I was a volunteer firefighter, and I was on the hazmat teams. And my specialty was weapons of mass destruction. Surprise, surprise. They sent me to all the federal training courses, and including the chemical course. When I went to the chemical course in Alabama, we were trained with live agent, sarin and VX nerve agent. We would go into a room that was contaminated so that we could test, you know, detection. We could test decontamination. We could make sure that we knew how to put on our gear properly, so that in the real thing, we had the confidence to be able to perform, because we had actually performed under a live agent threat. They do the same thing in Utah with biological weapons. Remember 2001, October, letters in the mail with anthrax. That anthrax came from the Utah facility. It was produced by the United States government. It was dry powdered anthrax in a tube. They lost control of it. Somebody took the tube, put the material in the envelopes, mailed it out. But we produced it. Now ask yourself why. We are signatories to the Biological Toxin and Weapons Convention, which means we're not supposed to have any biological weapons. But we say, well, that's not really a weapon. Well, it was used as a weapon, but no, it's not really a weapon. You see, because we use it for defensive purposes. And that's the thing. We have an expansive definition of defensive biological research that any logical person would look at and say, that's just an offensive biological weapons capability. And much of what we were doing in Ukraine was defensive biological research. But the reality is, now that the Russians have taken the documents and looked at it, it looks an awful lot like offensive biological weapons activity in violation of the treaty. The United States has a lot to answer for on this one, a lot. And I hope Congress starts asking the right questions, not because I want any harm to come to anybody, but because this can never happen again, ever happen again. Now, dirty bomb. I'm probably one of the few people in the world that's actually investigated a real live dirty bomb. The Iraqis produced them in 1987. They took these high explosive devices, they drilled them, and they inserted a irradiated zirconium core. They had a lot of zirconium for other weapons work. They put it in the Tuatha nuclear plant, irradiate, so it became zirconium-95, I believe, which is a highly radioactive substance, put it in the bomb, and then they actually blew two of them up, dropped them from airplanes, blew them up to measure the radiation. The idea in 1987 was to have enough of these bombs to seed a piece of territory where the Iranians were advancing, to create this lethal belt of radioactivity. So if the Iranians tried to go through it, they would die. So they exploded, they went in, they tested it. And what they found is that you had to be within 10 meters of the center of the explosion to get enough radiation to kill you. Well, gosh, I may be a Marine, but I'm smart enough to know that if you're 10 meters away from a 1,000-pound bomb going off, it ain't the radiation that killed you. All right, so it's just a stupid weapon, and the Iraqis went, there's no reason for us to do it, and they didn't. They dropped it. The Israelis tested because, you know, after 9/11, we went into Iraq or into Afghanistan, and we found designs that showed that Al-Qaeda was considering coming up with some sort of dirty bomb. The idea was to get commercially available radioactive material, put it with high explosive, blow it up in a urban area and contaminate it, act of terrorism. It has no military value, purely an act of terrorism. And we had a guy, Jose Padilla, that actually flew over there, talked to the Al-Qaeda about this, came to the United States, got arrested, and people made a big stink about that. In Russia, in Moscow, the Chechens took some cesium, highly radioactive material, put it around high explosive and put it in a park, Ismailivska Park. And it was discovered by the Russians and disarmed before it was used, but that would have been a dirty bomb. They did another one, I think in '98, along a railroad track. Again, radioactive material, high explosive. The Russians got it. It didn't go off. The Israelis tested it from 2010 to 2014, I believe. They detonated 22 dirty bombs of various configurations. And they came up with the same result, that a dirty bomb doesn't work. It doesn't do what everybody thinks it's going to do. It's very little radioactivity, more psychological in nature than a real threat. The problem is that people still believe that it could be a threat. And now we come to the Ukraine issue. I think you want me to address that incident. The Russians made a lot of phone calls recently to high-level phone calls from Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, to his counterparts, where he was telling them, we think Ukraine's getting ready to do a dirty bomb, and we need you to do something about this to prevent it. I think Shoigu did the right thing. Now, I'm an old intelligence officer, not as old as some of the people in this room, but I'm getting there. I've got a lot of experience in deconstructing statements made about information and determining what the possible or probable sources of that information were. And when the Russians released all the information they had about what they thought was going to happen, where the Ukrainians were going to take a Tochka-U missile and fire it over Chernobyl, intercept it, have it blow up, and then present material that would show that it was an Iskander missile and that the Iskander missile had a nuclear warhead on it, and that there was radiation that matched the radioactive fallout, not from a full-on nuclear explosion, but what you would get with a fizzle, where you have a nuclear bomb to go off. You need the uniform compression of the core so that it creates the fission and it blows up, critical mass. But if you have a premature detonation, let's just say one of the explosives go off, you get a fizzle. It doesn't give you the big nuclear explosion. It just does a partial sizzle, and then it just blows it up. But is specific radioactive material that's produced from that's unique to that event. And so the Ukrainians were calling around and asking, can we recreate this? We need the following isotopes. How can we recreate that and then get that so we can disseminate it and detect it and make it look like the Russians did something? The specificity of that information suggests two things. One, that there was somebody relatively close to the Ukrainian president, because some of these decisions that the Russians were talking about were presidential level decisions. Now, if the Russians are talking about it, that means it's not somebody right next to the president. Because if you got somebody right next to the president, you never talk about that source ever, because you'll lose it. And you don't talk about one that's one removed or even two removed. This is somebody who knows a cousin of a friend who drives a truck, who knows somebody who knows this, who knows that, who knows this, and they have indirect information about what happened in a presidential meeting. So it's rumor. It's rumor. So you have a rumor of presidential involvement, and then you have very specific information about technical issues that probably come from phone calls being made to specific institutes, asking pointed questions about this, that, and the other thing. And the Russians collected all this information, and some analysts like myself looked at it and went, holy cow, I got to brief somebody. They don't have proof that Ukraine was going to do this. They have chatter. And so he went to his boss and said, it looks like the Ukrainians might be considering using a dirty bomb. And Shoigu went to Putin and said, what do we do? And Putin said, make the phone calls. And they did. And as a result, I don't believe the Ukrainians were going to do this. What I think happened is that the Ukrainians recognized they were in a very dire situation and they need NATO to intervene. And so there were different scenarios being thrown out there, one of which we know. The deputy foreign minister got up and said, if you allow this Russian bombing to occur, we're going to hit Europe with a mass of refugees. And the only way to stop our refugees from coming in is for NATO to come in and help us. So they've already played that card. I believe somebody said we could do a false flag. And somebody said, what would that entail? And they started making the phone calls to find out, could they do it? And, but I believe no matter what you think of Zelensky, I don't think he's insane enough to do something like that. And I don't think this ever got beyond the initial planning stage. But the Russians made their phone calls, and I believe people called Zelensky, and there will not be a dirty bomb problem ever again out of Ukraine. That's my personal belief.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everyone. We're going to start transitioning to the book signing. So we're going to cut off the feed for the live stream. Everyone watching at home, thank you so much for joining us. Scott, do you have any final words for people watching at home?
Just to build on what I was talking about with this gentleman here, knowledge is power. If you're an American citizen, or you're anybody who believes in democracy and freedom, empower yourself with knowledge and information. Thanks for tuning in tonight. But here's my challenge to you. Remember at the beginning where I said I wasn't a Russian propagandist and I wasn't an information terrorist? Treat me like I am. Treat everything I said here tonight as if it was Russian propaganda, that I am an information terrorist trying to warp your minds. And then challenge me. Do the research. Follow up. Don't accept anything I said at face value. Make me back it up. Go in, dig, do the research, because you know what happens then? You empower yourself through your engagement. It's not about me telling you to believe something. It's about you believing it because you did the research, because you challenged. So I am a Russian propagandist. Don't believe anything I said here tonight. Challenge everything and do your own research.
Great.